Hi, my name is Vincent, and I am a machine learning engineer over at Explosion. In this video, we're going to talk about the task of finding bad examples in training data, and in particular, we're going to use the Google QuickDraw dataset as a motivating example. The QuickDraw dataset comes from this online experiment that's hosted by Google, and it's an experience that's very similar to Pictionary. As a user, you get this prompt to draw something, let's say a cat, and then you get a few seconds to do so. And because there's this little bit of a gaming element in it, many thousands of people have contributed these doodles. And all these doodles put together have led to this enormous data set containing over 50 million drawings of 300 odd objects. It's a pretty big data set, and it's also, I believe, somewhat popular in certain benchmarking tasks. Now, there's a very interesting issue with this data set, though. If we think about how this data set got collected, then we also have to consider, well, it is drawn by random people on the internet. And these people, sure, they might be engaged in this fun little game, but their primary concern won't be to deliver very high-quality training data. And moreover, these users, they might be having fun, but they will also be having a time constraint because they really only get a few seconds to draw the queried object. And when you consider that, then you might wonder if we can actually trust a machine learning model blindly when it's trained on this training data. Much of the data can be fine, but we do have some reasons to assume that there's going to be some bad examples mixed in as well. And depending on the task that we have with our machine learning model, we might certainly want to filter out these bad examples before doing any sort of training. Now, this task of finding the bad examples, that is the task that I'm very much interested in discussing in this video. Given that we have a dataset with labels, can we find examples of data that should be removed before we train a machine learning model? And it's a fairly general problem, but what I would like to do in this video is just show you a pragmatic setup on how to do this with the Google QuickDraw dataset. Now, a very interesting thing about addressing this task is that it really helps to have a human in the loop. We don't have a dataset that we can trust perfectly, so we are going to need to manually verify that we're indeed removing the bad examples. And that is why, in this video, we're going to be leveraging Prodigy. Prodigy is a data annotation tool that we develop here, over at Explosion, meant to help data professionals get started with meaningful machine learning projects by allowing them to label their own data themselves. A main feature of Prodigy is that we can fully customize the labeling experience with our own custom Python code. And that means that nothing is stopping us from using our favorite machine learning tricks as we keep the human in the loop. And in particular, we're going to explore a really nice machine learning trick that is able to find some bad examples for us, such that we don't need to check every single example in the data set ourselves. The goal of this video is to inspire you with techniques that you can use to find bad examples in your own training data. Data quality is definitely something that we need to take serious in this field, and the techniques that I'm going to show you in this video can also be used on use cases that go beyond the Google QuickDraw dataset. I'm also going to show you everything that I do inside of Jupyter. I'm going to start from scratch. And by the end of the video, we are going to have a little project with Prodigy that is a pretty pragmatic starting point for finding bad examples in training data. Now, having said all of that, let's just have a look at the QuickDraw experience, just so we know a little bit better what kind of data we can expect. Okay, so right now I have loaded the QuickDraw interface. This is the website that Google provides. And the moment that I hit this Let's Draw button over here, then you're going to be able to see the actual interface that many people have been playing with. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you what it's like. One thing that's safe to observe is that I do have a fancy drawing tablet over here that I will be using as I'm drawing. But let's just give a quick demo of what this interface is like. I'm just going to hit Let's Draw over here. And I have to draw a newspaper, and note that I only get 20 seconds to draw it. Notice that the moment that I hit Got It over here, you are also going to see some predictions from Google appear at the bottom. They have a big data set of all of these doodles with drawings, So while I'm drawing, Google is going to try to predict what it actually is that I'm doodling. But let's give this a spin. So I guess. So I guess like a big. There we go. So in this case, Google was definitely able to guess what I was drawing, but you also notice that I was under a little bit of time pressure already. And I should also observe that I'm cheating a little bit here because typically a lot of people do this on their mobile phone, and I'm definitely using a fancy drawing utensil here. So you could wonder, well, is every single drawing going to be quite accurate? And to investigate that, we're going to look at the data that is actually being generated. If we go back to the original page, we can click on this link to the world's largest doodling data set. And we see a couple of examples of other items that you can draw. But you can also go to this GitHub link over here that says Get the Data. And when you click that link, you're going to go to the QuickDraw dataset repository. And here you get a little bit of extra information. So for example, one of the things that we can see here is that there are indeed about 50 million drawings across 345 categories. So we're definitely talking about a pretty big data set here. But if you scroll down a little bit more to the bottom, you will also find download links. There we go. So there's this Get the Data section over here. I will be using Jupyter notebooks, so I think the NumPy format should be just fine. And when you hit this link, you are going to go to a Google Cloud storage bucket, where for every single label that they have to draw, they have a big NumPy file with lots of examples that are drawn. And in my case, I'm just going to pick the first example that's listed here. So we are going to try to find bad examples of drawn Eiffel Towers. That's what we're going to try to do over here. And the reason why I'm only zooming in on just this first category over here is mainly because, the files are pretty big, and I think just exploring the Eiffel Tower dataset is going to be interesting enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to download this file locally, and then I'll open it up inside of Jupyter Lab. All right, so I am inside of my Jupyter Lab environment now, and what I'm doing is I'm loading in this big NumPy array, and that NumPy array is the data from the Eiffel Tower from QuickDraw. But by doing this, we do have this big array with numeric values that indicate the grayscale value. And what I can do is I can just grab the first row in this array, and here you can see that I have lots of numbers. This doesn't represent the actual image though. What I need to do for that is I need to reshape this NumPy array like so. But the easiest way to just get a glimpse of what's being drawn here is to use matplotlib. And what I can do from here is I can type plt.imageShow. And this is going to actually give me like a little rendering of what I'm actually drawing here. But I think I would like to draw this in black and white. So I need to set the color map as well. But here is supposedly an example of a drawn Eiffel Tower. And here's the next image. And the next one. And the next one. And there's lots of images being represented in this NumPy array. But I can just plot them if I would like. And also one thing that's also just good to just observe is that just in terms of Eiffel Towers, we seem to have about 130,000 or so examples. So we have a fair amount of examples here. I think to just get a nice little glimpse of all of these images, I'm going to do one more trick, because I think it's going to be nice if I can just not look at one image at a time, but maybe look at a couple of them in a grid. So let's write the code for that. Okay, and here's the code that I need to make the grid that I just mentioned. The way that this basically works is I'm just grabbing random examples from my big data set, and then I'm placing that in a 6x6 grid, which means that every time that I run this, I am going to get a new set of examples of what's supposed to be an Eiffel Tower. This is kind of nice because you can kind of see an overview of different styles as well. But also from just looking at this just real quick, you can already wonder, well, are all of these examples equally good? So for example, this example is a little bit off because it feels like it's more like a hill maybe. But if you squint your eyes, I guess you could call that the Eiffel Tower. But this one isn't. I really have trouble seeing the Eiffel Tower in that. And I can imagine that this was drawn when the user was just very rushed, so to say. Let's run this again, just for good measure. Okay, so here we've got another set of drawn Eiffel Towers. And here again, I see this one example that just throws me off a little bit. I can imagine that a user might be just quite stressed and fiddling with the interface. And I get that, but I don't think this is a good example of an Eiffel Tower. This really just feels like a line. So this is an interesting point. I have my data and I can sort of play around with it just from the notebook. But what I would like to do now is maybe just come up with some sort of a trick that allows me to not have to go through every single one of these examples of drawings, but maybe I can do something such that maybe these examples will just pop up. So let's talk about a trick. So let's consider a sequence of steps that we might be able to perform on our set of images. Now the set of images that we have, they all belong to the same class. That is to say, we should be able to expect that they're all Eiffel Tower images. But for each image, we also have a corresponding array. We had this NumPy vector, that you might remember, that has pixel values inside of it. And in our case, it's a relatively small vector because we're dealing with smaller images, but we do have this correspondence between an image and a numeric vector. If you were doing this on a different set of images, you might be using a neural network instead, one that's pre-trained to retrieve an embedding. But for our use case for now, the only thing that's really important is that we have some sort of way to encode the image as an array. Now, the next thing that we can do is we can take this array and we can see if we can make it maybe just a little bit smaller. The idea is that we're going to do some dimensionality reduction here, and in particular, we're going to be using UMAP for this. UMAP, for all intents and purposes in this video, is just a dimensionality reduction technique. It's in a way similar to principal component analysis, PCA, you might have heard of that. It's a variant of that. The main reason why I like using UMAP here is because clusters of points that appear close together in the high dimensional space also tend to be close together in the low dimensional space. And that's a property that UMAP has, and it has a fast implementation as well, which is why we're using it here. But again, here also, the most important thing is that we have our big array that now gets turned into a much smaller array. So that means that we are able to go from an image to a two-dimensional point. And that means that we might be able to draw such a point on a scatter chart. And we can do this for one image, but we can also do that for two images. In fact, we can do it for lots of images. And when we do that, we get this large point cloud in our scatter chart. And that scatter chart is going to be something that will help us, because we can wonder what kind of properties we would expect from such a scatter chart. Now, if I start thinking about the properties that I would expect in this scatter chart, then I am reminded that all of these images are supposed to be similar. After all, they're all Eiffel Towers, right? So you could argue that this scatter chart should basically just be this one blob of points where all the points are just kind of close together. What I perhaps would not expect, if all of these images actually were similar, is that we had a scatter chart where we might have one main big cluster, but maybe with some side clusters as well. The reasoning here is that if we have a single cluster, that we might be able to say, well, this implies similarity across the board. Yet if we have some of these side clusters, that might imply a difference from a subgroup with the rest of the group. However, this is also where something interesting might happen. If we make a scatter chart and we indeed see that there's this minor subgroup that's different, then that might also be the subgroup with examples that are unlike the rest. And in our case, that might just be lots of examples that aren't Eiffel Towers. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to make this scatter chart in my Jupyter notebook, and we're going to see that indeed there is a little side cluster that appears, and then we're just going to have a look at the examples that are in that little side cluster. All right, so I am back inside of Jupyter Lab right now, And what I'm doing is I'm importing the big UMAP class over here from the UMAP Learn package. This is going to do the dimensionality reduction that I was interested in. I have my original X array over here. That's the original pixel values that we had. And what I have over here is another array, but this one has the dimensionality reduced. So I can confirm that by just checking the shapes. So we can see that the number of rows did not change at all, but the number of columns definitely did, and that's because we did the dimensionality reduction. And what I can now do, because this is basically just an array with 2 columns, is I can plot them in a scatter chart. And when I do that, this is what it looks like. And there's interesting things when you look at this. For starters, we do see that there is indeed, in general, quite a big blob over here. So that is something that you would expect. These are probably lots of similarly drawn Eiffel Towers, I guess. But we also see that there's like a little bit of a edge over here. There's a little bit of a weird cluster over there. But in particular, there's a little bit of a weird worm-shaped cluster, I guess, located over here. And just from eyeballing this, I am immediately kind of curious what these examples might actually look like. Assuming that points close together in this space are also close together in the picture space, there's something to be said that these might just represent drawings that are just a little bit different. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make another one of these grid charts where we see lots of drawings, and I'm going to randomly sample items from this region just to see if indeed examples from this region are different. So I want to make a before and after just very clearly. So just to emphasize, if I just pluck random images from my big data set, then these are the Eiffel Tower examples that I get. But if I sample them from that weird little cluster, then I get this. Now, this is just a sample, of course, but just from gauging this, there's lots of non-Eiffel Tower items in here. There's a line, there's just a couple of specks over here. This is, I suppose, a more random building. But for sure, there's lots of examples in here that I think do not belong to the Eiffel Tower class. So we seem to have found a trick or a way to just grab lots of examples of non-Eiffel Towers. And I can resample this a bunch of times. So here's another sample. Again, I can see some examples of just lines here. So I think I am pretty good at finding examples that aren't Eiffel Towers. Though it should also be said that there are some question marks. Like, I do think that this potentially could be a picture of an Eiffel Tower. So that means that I can't assume that everything that I'm sampling here is, of course, not an Eiffel Tower. But I do think that I have a method where I'm getting enough examples of not Eiffel Tower that I can go ahead and move this into Prodigy. This is a point in time where I'm confident that I can start labeling and that I will actually get lots of examples that I do want to remove. So the homework in Jupyter is now done. And what I would like to do now is just move this into Prodigy. I think that's the next step. So right now I'm at the point where I want to move data into Prodigy. But at this point, it also helps to observe that one of the core features of our labeling tool is that you're able to customize it with your own Python code. And that is definitely something that I'm going to do in this video. If you're interested in doing that yourself as well, I do advise you to first check out the documentation page. And in particular, you're going to want to check out the custom recipes section as well as the custom interfaces section. Prodigy can handle images, audio, and text, and there are lots of pre-built recipes for you to use. But if you want to do something custom with HTML, you can also totally do that. And the guides for that can be found over here. Having said that, this is my Visual Studio Code environment with my own custom Prodigy project. It is a relatively small project, but what I want to do is just go over a couple of important files, and hopefully that'll make the flow clear as well. The first file, by the way, is the Eiffel Tower indices file. This is a file that I made off screen, and it's just a JSON lines file, which means that on every line there's a JSON blob. And in particular, the one thing that it's storing is just this index. And that index refers to the index inside of that X matrix that we had before. And that's basically just keeping track of all the items that are worth checking. These were the items in that little strange blob that we saw earlier. So I just have this list of items to check, and that is something I can pass on to Prodigy. Now, the next thing is that I have also made a custom recipe, and that's stored in this Python file. And the recipe inside of Prodigy is just a definition of a user interface for a specific labeling task. And very typically, if you were writing your own, you would be using this Prodigy recipe decorator, which allows you to define your own labeling interface. So just to briefly go over the moving parts in this file, I have a Eiffel Tower.jsonl file that I'm loading in. That will be the file that you just saw. And I'm just extracting all the indices that are relevant. And then I also have this separate URL for the image server. Now this is a little bit unconventional, but the thinking here is that I'm about to start a Prodigy server, and I have all of these indices, and I could write all of the images on disk that I have, and I can use these indices to then read them inside of Prodigy. But that would be a bit of an inconvenience, because I do have a lot of these images that I might need to store on disk then. So to make it easy for myself, I've just made this image API, where from Prodigy, I am just able to give it the index that I'm interested in, and then this image server is just going to host the image back to Prodigy, so that Prodigy can show me what I'm supposed to label. This is really just a separation of concerns thing that I thought would be just easier to maintain. So the URL that you see over here, that is actually referring to an image server, which, by the way, is hosted in this other file called server.py. It is a fast API microservice. The only thing it does is it has a URL where you're able to send in an index, and then there's some custom logic such that I'm loading in the Eiffel Tower dataset and I'm giving back an image. There's some details, but that's really the only thing that this service is doing. But that means that what I am able to do inside of my custom recipe over here is I am able to refer to HTML to render inside of Prodigy, and I'm able to use that image URL to basically just handle the generation of all of these images on my behalf. I am building this stream of things that I would like to check. It's a generator, and I'm using the classification view ID. And what am I looking at? Well, I'm looking at this HTML that I'm generating in this stream. The goal here isn't necessarily to have a recipe that's perfect, but it is a recipe that I can just confirm whether or not it works, and then I can sort of just get a feel of what the labeling experience is like. I suppose the final file that's also just good to maybe mention is I've added a makefile to this project, basically because this just makes it easy for me to say, look, make the image server for me and start the Prodigy single server for me. So what I should be able to do now is just go to the terminal. From here, I should be able to type make image server. And when I run that command, I'm running the script that's under there. And I can also do the same thing for make Prodigy single. And when I now go to this Prodigy link, then this is the user interface that I am presented with. I have my familiar bar at the bottom that allows me to accept or reject images that I see. I can confirm that indeed an image is being rendered over here. I have a label that says, hey, is this the Eiffel Tower, yes or no? And what I'm able to do using keyboard shortcuts is I'm able to hit accept or reject. The shortcut for accept is A, the shortcut for reject is X. So I should be able to say here, look, this is not the Eiffel Tower. This is also not the Eiffel Tower. Neither is this. Neither is this. And I'm able to just start labeling from here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to label for a bit, and then I'm going to reflect on maybe some of the lessons that I've learned. Okay. So I'm at the point now where I've been labeling for a bit. I have 57 examples labeled. I also have what I think is definitely an example of not an Eiffel Tower. But it is a good point in time for me to just reflect a little bit. Now, one thing I've noticed is that this does work, but I am wondering if I might be able to make my labeling experience just a little bit better. Because what this experience is really just reminding me of is kind of like one of these online CAPTCHAs, where you get this grid of all of these different pictures, and then you get the question of, hey, could you select all the cars? Well, maybe I'm able to do that, but for this little Eiffel Tower data set. It definitely seems like most of the examples that I'm sampling are not Eiffel Towers, so there's something to perhaps be said to also make a labeling interface that's a little bit more like this CAPTCHA. So let's explore that. I think that's going to be an interesting alternative to the current labeling environment. Now, as luck would have it, there's actually a neat little section on how to build this CAPTCHA interface. If you go to the computer vision segment of the documentation page, and if you scroll down a little bit, you should see this little demo. And in this case, you just see 3 images, but you do see this interface where you're able to click and you're able to light up certain images and not others. And I'm thinking that this layout, but in a 3x3 grid, is going to work quite well. And in fact, here's what it looks like. Instead of seeing 1 image at a time, I now see 9. And what's also quite convenient about this view is that I can use keyboard shortcuts to make my selection. So for example, if I hit 1 now, then I'm automatically selecting an element. And it's just kind of nice that I'm able to do that without having to use the mouse. So in this case, I don't think I see any Eiffel Towers, so I'll just go ahead and hit accept. But in this case, if I squint my eyes a bit, I think number 8 could plausibly be an Eiffel Tower. So I'll hit accept here again now. Now, the way that I've set this up is a little bit non-standard, and I think it might be interesting to see how you might be able to set up a Prodigy server properly with an interface that looks like this one. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to save my labeled data so we can kind of get an impression of what that actually looks like. So I'm going to hit the save button over here just to make sure that all of my annotations are saved. So now that that data is saved, I can open that up in Jupyter, and we'll see that when you have data shown this way, that the labels themselves are actually kind of nested. Okay, so we're back inside of Jupyter over here, and what I would just like to do is just have a look at our labeled examples. And remember, we had examples labeled from 2 sets. I have one set where I was labeling 1 image at a time, and then I also just showed you this other way of labeling where we are labeling 9 elements at a time with this little CAPTCHA-like environment. So let's just have a quick look at what the label data looks like. And I can get that by using this part of the Prodigy API. I can connect to my local database. And from there, I can ask it to just give me a labeled data set. And when I run this, I'm going to get a list of dictionaries that contains all the information. In particular, I can see this ID that I provided, as well as this HTML link. And I can see from the answer key over here whether or not something was accepted or rejected. Yeah, and for each and every single image, I have another one of these dictionaries. There are also some things that I didn't add manually myself, like this input hash over here. That's something that Prodigy added. But effectively, these are the labels that I'm getting. Now let's contrast that with the labels in the other set. And if I just have a look at this very first element, you'll notice that I have a list, and inside of that there's a dictionary. And just to make it a bit simpler, let's just look at the last item here. So that's just one dictionary. Then we can see that we have lots of options, and that's because we will have 9 different images that we are dealing with at a time. And then if I scroll all the way at the bottom, then you can see over here that in the accept call that there's a list, and that is referring to the items that I have indeed deemed to be a Eiffel Tower. And you'll notice that 1745 is an ID that's also listed over here. So I am able to label 9 items at a time, but this also will have a small effect in how the data gets represented inside of my Prodigy database. Prodigy handles this in a very consistent way for you, but there is this one little detail that does deserve mentioning, and that is this input hash that is attached to all of these options. Now this hash is basically Prodigy's way of keeping track of whether or not something has already been labeled. Prodigy is able to hash more than just one key, So I could hash the ID as well as this image URL, for example. That's something you could do. In this case, I think hashing this ID should already be sufficient. But if I'm going to be building a labeling service on top of this, then of course it will be nice if I can just build a little bit of a tracking mechanism in here, such that I'm sure that I'm not labeling the same item over and over again. And because I am dealing with a custom recipe, I think it will be kind of nice to just show you how you might be able to do that. Because we don't want to label the same thing more than once, and we should also keep in the back of our minds that the data structure for a CAPTCHA-like grid is just slightly different because the options are nested. So that means that I don't want to grab the input hash of the collection of items. In this case, what I probably want to do is I want to make sure that I compare against an input hash that's associated with each and every single image. Now, it's not a whole lot of code to write this, but it's definitely one of these things that it's good to be aware of. So with that out of the way, let's just have a quick look at the code so that's clear as well. So I'm back in Visual Studio Code now, and hopefully with the explanation that I just gave you, it's just a little bit more clear what this fetch existing hashes function does. What I'm able to do is I'm able to fetch all the examples from a given data set using the Prodigy API. And what I'm able to do is I'm just able to collect all the already existing hashes. So for every single dictionary that I have in this data set, I can go over every single option in that dictionary to fetch the input hash. This is going to give me all the pre-existing hashes. And that means that I can use that inside of my Prodigy recipe to only add items that haven't been labeled yet. How does that work? Well, I'm still looping over all the image indices that I loaded up earlier. I'm still generating this one option. What I'm then doing is I'm saying, hey, let's use Prodigy to add a hash to this option using this setHashes method. And what's kind of nice about it is it allows me to say, well, these are the keys that matter as far as uniqueness goes. So that means that you're able to say, well, there are two keys that really matter that make this one option unique, and the rest maybe doesn't. And this is really nice when you're doing something that's maybe a little bit more elaborate and you want to have tight manual control over how a duplicate is defined. So that's just very nice to know that that's available. But with this hash added, what I can now do is I can say, hey, this new option that I'm considering, the input hash that's attached to that, do I already have that in my pre-existing hashes set? And if I don't, then I can consider it for labeling. Then I can add it to this options list. And once I have 9 items in that options list, then I'm going to yield this set of options that are then ready to label. And when you put all of these things together inside of a view that's of type choice, then you end up with a labeling interface that looks like this, where you're also sure that you're not going to label the same thing twice. So that I thought was just kind of nice to show how you might be able to build that. But moreover, what I can do now is I can actually start labeling. So what I think will be fun to do is just label with this interface for a bit, just so I can review which approach I like more. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I think in this set there are no very convincing Eiffel Towers. Okay, so I've been labeling for a while now. I think I've really found another really good example of not the Eiffel Tower, just somebody who didn't know how to draw the Eiffel Tower, I suppose. But I do have an interesting observation which I want to share before we wrap up this video. So I think in general, this layout works quite well. I'm definitely a fair bit faster. I was timing myself just now, and I think before, if I was labeling about 200 images, it would take me 5 minutes. And with this interface, it seems to take me about 1 minute or so. So there's definitely a bit of a speed up, I suppose, that I have. But I have also observed that there's a downside of labeling it with this interface. It's not necessarily perfect. And the reason is that I cannot skip. So in the bar that you see over here, you are able to accept, you're able to reject, you're able to go back if you think you've made a bad label, but you're also able to say, hey, let's skip this one example. And let's say, just as a sake of argument, that I'm not sure if this is a very clear example of the Eiffel Tower, but it's also not really a clear example of not the Eiffel Tower, then I might want to say, you know, let's just skip this one. I don't want to have an opinion about this just yet. Well, then in this interface, it's very hard for me to do so. I can either select an element or I can deselect an element, but I can't skip an individual element. For that, I will need an individual view. So that's something I didn't expect, but certainly something that I noticed as I was labeling this way. But I think looking back, there's been just a couple of interesting lessons from this little exercise. So what I would like to do is just wrap up this video by sharing some of the overarching lessons that I've learned as I've been building this. So where are we right now? Well, right now we kind of have a little approach that works quite well for finding bad examples in training data. We start with a big data set, then inside of Jupyter we apply a trick to create a smaller set where there's more likely candidates of bad examples, and then we're able to pass it on to Prodigy, where we were able to find two relatively useful ways of labeling. So that means that we have this nice little human in the loop, but we also have some machine learning tricks that are helping us out, and this combination keeps things nice and pragmatic. If I were to look at a couple of explicit lessons that I learned while building this, then I would say that my first lesson is that we seem to have stumbled upon a trick that works quite well. We're really only using UMAP with a dimensionality reduction and a chart, but I was surprised to find that we were actually able to find some very valid bad examples with this approach. If you were doing this in general on other image datasets, then you might need to add an embedding in the mix as well, but in general I'm actually quite pleased with the current trick. Another lesson that I learned is that there's definitely more than one interface to consider as you're labeling inside of Prodigy. I like to think that I have two very valid ways of labeling at the moment, but it definitely was better that I explore two instead of just sticking to one, because there's lessons that you will learn as you're labeling, and it'd be a shame if you're not iterating on the approach. Looking back, I also like to think that this was a relatively simple thing to build. We didn't have to write too much code, and the entire setup was made in an afternoon or so. The very general pattern of, hey, we have a trick inside of Jupyter, we might be able to use that to generate candidates for Prodigy. That's a very pragmatic way of just exploring a data set from different angles. So that's definitely a pattern that I will likely repeat later on. Having said this, there are also some ideas that I have for further improvement. First of all, I think that even though we have a trick that works quite well, it might still be a good idea to consider some other tricks too. The fact that our approach works well is nice, but that's not to say that our approach is perfect. There might still be some bad candidates that our current approach doesn't catch, so it would also be good to maybe consider some other approaches from Jupyter as well. Next, I think that while the approach that I have right now is useful, a very good next step would be to think a little bit more about the label-task interaction. Right now, I'm using the label Eiffel Tower to select items and to declare them whether or not they are part of the Eiffel Tower set. But there's something to be said that maybe we instead want to have a label that's more like bad example. There were lots of lines and dots and very obvious cases that don't belong to the Eiffel Tower. And there were also a couple of cases where there was just a little bit of doubt. And to figure out what label makes most sense, it helps to think a little bit about the task that the machine learning model needs to perform after. And I don't have a very clear definition of that at the moment, and I think if that's more clear, then I'm also able to construct perhaps a better label. And that's definitely a next step that I would do at this phase of the project. Now I suppose the biggest lesson and also the biggest thing I want to do next is to consider similar approaches on other data sets and other use cases too. I think this has been a very nice example of how bad examples can seep into training data, but data quality is actually very important, and this is just an example of a dataset with bad examples. I'm pretty sure there are many others out there as well. What I'm hoping is that this example is a motivating or perhaps inspiring example for you, such that you might try to do similar approaches yourself. But if there's any lesson to be had here, is that data quality genuinely is something to take serious, because it's just a little bit too easy for bad examples to seep in.